Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. Today we had two exciting sessions. The first session had, for example, Roy Vinky that I chaired that session. So we had three chairs. So what we are gonna do is pretty much as I just did now. I chair the session of Roy Vinky that talk about the grazing in the Anthropocene back to the future. So I will invite the other two or three chairs, to introduce the speakers that we had in those sessions, and then invite the speakers to say 1-2 sentence max to prompt the discussion in this general questions and answer discussion.
Hi, Pablo. Hi, everybody. Yeah, my name's Ritoti, and I had Carol Kervin present about Kazakhstan and pastoralism, and sort of, do an incredible work with about 100 years of looking at how things have changed. I feel a couple of the things which really sort of stood out for me is that historically there is that, idea of state building, and the state is trying to create a certain kind of a community. However, what the state wants to create doesn't always fit well with the social and ecological needs of pastoralism per se, right? And so she sort of talked about, this nomadic versus settlerism, the start of the Bolsheviks and the communist revolution in that part of the world, and how it's essentially now led to this kind of industrialized nomadism, and where we have right now kind of a mix between the way things were in the past and the way things are now, where things are a lot more privatized. And so it's very interesting to think about this new way of pastoralism in this age, where public-private partnerships or ownership of land as well as stock is very place-based, and where we go from there is a very interesting question, but I think that's where we were.
That's good. Anita, would you go for your session, and who?
Yep, so in the first session I had Professor Eva Schlitt, and she sort of talked about managing or using herding to manage rangelands. Eva, are you around to quickly summarize your presentation?
Well, yes. So I postulated that the services, and especially the ecosystem services that are provided by herded livestock grazing, exceed those provided by unattended grazing, even when we talk about large private rangelands or ranches. And I think, or my co-authors, and I think that we need to support the herders and the herding profession, not only in Africa, but also, for example, in Europe.
Thanks for that, Eva. I also had Luke Delaby, who talked about pasture-based dairy systems in temperate lowlands. Luke, do you want to quickly summarize your presentation?
Thank you, Anita. Yes, I think I can just summarize, as I explained, with banalities, in fact, that help to think. Grassland is for ruminants, ruminants is for grassland. How to improve this win-win duo?
In the second session, I was able to chair Bertrand Dumont, who talked about mobilizing ecological processes for herbivore production and sort of allowing farmers and researchers to work together. Professor Dumont, are you around to summarize your research, please?
What we try to present is really to the question we had was how to make farmers and researchers team up in identifying problems that apply locally and in implementing options to improve this. these problems and to solve these problems. And we discussed ideas related to the co-innovation frameworks that integrate system approach, or reflexive thinking about the system and social learning, and we showed that it can be quite variable according to there are different ways of doing social of doing co-innovation. And at the end of the discussion, a question arose, which is how to move from options that apply locally only, and as scientists, we want to produce also generic knowledge, or at least to produce a way of doing research that will help people in different conditions. And really a question for me is how to bridge the gap between knowledge that is produced locally and more generic knowledge based on principles that could apply more broadly.
Thank you very much, Anita. In session one, we had Professor Ian Gordon, the chair session, a breakout room session 4. We got there Dr. Hale. Dr. Hale, are you present now in this discussion? And if so, could you provide us with a few sentences of your talk and your research that you've been presenting in the book chapter with Michael Corral?
I think he's had to head off actually.
Oh, that's good. That's sorry. I was wondering why I couldn't see it here. But anyways, I will invite everybody to go to the excellent chapter in the book of Michael Corral, and that he co-authored that book. That book chapter with Dr. Hale now here in Ottawa University. So in session 2, I chair the breakout room 2. And had the presentation of Dr. Hiroki Ansai and Dr. Babu. I won't butcher your last name again, but Dr. Hiroki Ansai from Japan talk about how to use technology, especially GPS technology, at the small scale of Japanese farm to detect patterns of behavior, and based on that, enable better welfare management of the cows. And Dr. Babu Alemaje, who, sorry, I tried that, but I'm used to everybody butcher my last name anyways. But so he talked about how the climate change have had impact in Eastern Europe in the change of dietary requirements and diet formulations for dairy cows there. So if Hiroki, you are there, and Babu, you are there, I would invite Hiroki to put 2 sentences of what you are up to in your research in conjunction with Masahiko Hirata. So it seems like Hiroki decided to leave. But anyways, Babu, could you put 2 sentences of your research in Hungary?
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, I'm not a doctor actually. I'm a PhD student normally, just you can correct me or something. So our main objective is just due to the climate change, as I've mentioned, a lot of situations so far. So when you go to like further to the end of the century, the fate of crops and those crops which are normally used for the dairy cows are like
it seems like we lost you. We had some issues with your connection anyways during the presentation, so don't worry. I think I covered what your presentation was about, and we'll leave it for the discussion. But Ritodi, what about your session, your breakout room in session 2?
Yeah, so for session 2, I had Dr. Bill Lee, who gave a really interesting presentation about basically landscapes and landscape in the high country here in New Zealand, what we call rangelands across the world. And one of the things that was quite interesting is this fact that given New Zealand's very unique geographical position, there wasn't a lot of mammalian interaction with rangelands on these 2 islands. Which then brings up some really key questions around how we think about rangelands here, whether they belong in this landscape at all in terms of, understanding ecological health for the future. But also it raises other questions around the agricultural futures of New Zealand in terms of ownership of land and how we should be thinking about, let's say, managing land here in Aotearoa.
Thank you, Ritodi. So now we are open the floor for discussions, questions, and answers. So I would invite everybody to put questions, reflections, or challenges to the speakers. So please feel free to voice out your questions or suggestion or challenge, as it is hard to see you all in the screen. So please go ahead. So we've got a question for Lynn. Lynn, would you like to voice out your comment? Is that right? Or you would like me to read your question?
Well, I can voice it out. I put it in the chat because it's not a very important comment, but it's just that in the definition of rangelands used by the Society for Range Management, which is neither here nor there, they're just land that are most where the herbaceous component is dominant, not necessarily grazed by much of anything. I just wanted to point that out.
So thank you, Lynn.
Not a very important comment. Okay.
No, I saw you. I saw you in the chat, and I thought you had a question there.
No.
Yeah.
I can ask a question. This was for Bill, actually, which we couldn't get to in the last session. Bill, if you want to respond to this. And Stephen asked this. And if you're around, you can ask this yourself, or I can read it out for you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
yes.
Yes, I'm a landscape architect and have been very much involved with assessing outstanding natural landscapes. Now, the tussock grasslands are iconic landscapes for New Zealand, and they're highly valued for their grassland characteristics. So where do you see, Bill, the position or the place of these tussock grasslands, mainly in the mid-altitude areas, returning to a much woodier environment?
Yeah, I mean, to stop the natural succession, we're really going to have to micromanage some of these grasslands, and it depends on the scale at which we want to do it. Now, I know people are very fond of, tawny, tall tussocks waving in the wind, and that's fine, and they'll be around for a long time. But in terms of them going woody, that'll happen quite slowly in areas where we manage them for conservation. So I suspect it'll be an intergenerational change involving 3 generations. So hopefully by the 3rd generation, they've learned to appreciate the woodiness of the landscape as opposed to necessarily the grassness of the landscape. But in many areas, because the seed sources for woody are limited, and then I suspect the tussock grassland landscape will stay around for hundreds of years and won't really change much at all.
Thank you, Bill, for your answer. Is there any question to Bill or any comment? So I got a question to Bill, though. Bill, we have heard in previous Mondays the use of technology. We have heard about fenceless farms. We have talked about fenceless grazing landscape by Dave Swine. And we have this conflict nowadays with our pastoral production and the encroachment of pastoral production in those grasslands that didn't evolve or with mammals in there. But would you argue that now they can co-evolve with mammals like sheep, like deer, like cattle?
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly some species that would make that sort of evolutionary transition into herbivore tolerant systems in New Zealand, but it's a very small component of the vegetation. And as I said previously, they're probably species that are generalists, that are common, and not the sort of regionally unique or distinctive components of New Zealand biodiversity. So, yeah, it would take many generations to overcome what have been millions of years of evolution in the opposite direction, i.e., in not so much in the opposite direction, I suppose, but more in the absence of mammalian grazers. So it'll happen. It'll be slow. It'll be amongst a subset of the species. So I wouldn't. I think the potential is there. We just don't know what that in fact would look like. I mean, one question that I'd like to raise, which I kind of suggested in my talk, was that, you know, rangelands products in many parts of the world, not necessarily in more subsistence economies, but in other parts of the world, like we're producing meat and we're producing wool for well-off European markets. And there's this whole issue of the sort of ethics of that in terms of we're not feeding people, we're fattening people, and we're not keeping people warm with essential garments, we're overdressing people. And so how does that work? And has that come up in rangeland management elsewhere in the world?
I think Lynn wants to say something. Lynn,
Yep.
are you?
Well, I think Richard is first there.
Richard?
Yeah, I don't want to answer Bill's question. I think there's some other international people should respond to that. But so can we save and answer that? Please respond to Bill's challenge. But my question and muscle logic now I'm here was that maybe another question for other people overseas is that while Bill's talk excellently indicated the difficulties of grazing management on New Zealand, with the biodiversity is unique and is evolved in the absence of grazing mammals. Are there some similar parallels where you have grazing mammals overseas, but they have been almost completely substituted by different forms of grazers that have substantially different impacts on the indigenous ecosystem?
Lynn, did you want to respond to Bill?
Well, then I was wondering if somebody wanted to respond to Richard, but I was just going to say, I think Bill makes a good point. I'd say livestock meat in the United States feeds a bigger spectrum of the population in terms of both poor and rich, but also, at least in my area, it does provide a number of other benefits. And I guess my talk was about why it's the most widespread method we have in California of combating this horrible wildfire problem that we're facing, and also that it does contribute to biodiversity in our state, which has some parallels. I mean, our grassland is heavily occupied by non-native species that are not going to disappear no matter what we do. And the only way to control them and to allow the indigenous species to flourish is through grazing. So we have those, a sort of a spectrum of benefits there, but also some trade-offs. I mean, there's just trade-offs, and we're not very good at evaluating those trade-offs, and we need to be better at it.
I was quite hooked in that comment about we are fattening people and we are overdressing people. Does anybody want to comment on that? Fred, you've been quiet all the time, all this morning. I wonder when you're going to speak up. We are going to hear you anyways next Monday, but I wonder if you have something to comment, Fred.
Pablo, I've been very much enjoying the sessions. My only regret is that I couldn't listen to all of the sessions, just listening to the wonderful information that people have. A thought that comes to me, Bill, relative to your challenge, and I appreciate that certainly, is to think about the costs of the diets we eat nowadays globally. Reading recently, it's $2 trillion. And to me, it's very related to the challenge, the question that you're raising in terms of the ultra processed foods that are being put out nowadays and what that's doing globally for the health of people. The costs are going to be unsustainable at a global level. Certainly in the US, it's a disaster, and it's moving globally. And so this whole idea of producing more food for other people in other places, I think more food, clothing, and so forth is very relevant. And I think a lot about local, what needs to be done locally, producing locally, and maintaining communities. One of the things, and that strikes me listening to the sessions today, it all becomes so local, what's happening at different situations, from the management of grazing to the people. And And I think when we don't acknowledge that localness and the value of that and how to work with that, I think we really miss huge opportunities, really. So that's kind of wandering around, but I appreciate your point, Bill. Let me say that, you know, and I think a lot about that.
That your comment, Fred, relates quite a lot to last Monday presentation of Professor Hirani Matunga about that indigeneity, that what you said, Fred, the advantage to be local. How do you know and relate to the land? So Bertrand, sorry, I don't want to put you in a spot there, but I know what the excellent work you've conducted in my part of the world, in the Pampas, and your excellent work that you've been conducting in France. So could you tell us a little bit more about the experience of how you are, in your experience of integrating farmers in your work from the very beginning in these sort of localities, if you like?
I have to put the microphone on. Thanks, Pablo. Just what I presented in the talk is two experiences. One coming from South America, where in the cow-calf system there was a management framework that was proposed based on changing herbage allowance along the seasons and trying to make it consistent with the cow requirements, so that the reproductive cycle of cows is being more efficient, and so that was for me very applied research. And but the people working in Uruguay came to the conclusion, although they tried to propose applied research, it was not very much used in the world of farmers, and that's why they developed a transdisciplinary network with farmer advisors and researchers, and they worked closely together for a period of 3 years to see how it can improve the implementation of practices. And in only 3 years, they had quoted a number of innovations, and the local adoption of innovation increased from 37 to 70 to 97% just in 3 years, just by the fact that the farmers were involved in the process right from the beginning, and they expressed their view, and they were probably more prone to also to integrate the knowledge that had been produced in experimental situation. And the other example I discuss is something that occurs in a PDO area in France, where in this case, we started from a crisis situation where people did not really communicate. And so in this case, we did not really bring new knowledge, but we used some type of games that represent the interaction that occur within a farming system. And we transform this as a game, and we made farmers and other local stakeholders playing this game and trying to find solution for their problems themselves in a way that doing this, playing a game, reduces all the power relationship between the players, because you're no longer a farmer, you're no longer an industrial who's managing a dairy, you're no longer a researcher, you're no longer someone who wants to protect the environment. You just become a player, and doing this, it facilitates the exchange between people who don't have the same priorities in their landscape. And it makes people think on how can I convince, why does the other is saying that, and how can I convince people to also listen to my voice. So these were the two examples I developed in my talk. And the conclusion is that in the first case, there were some indicators showing that the performance of a farm increased. And in the second case, there were some indication that the local dynamic was changed, because they moved to other practices. They developed more 100% aid diet in 30 other farms, which was an important result. So we showed doing this that by engaging farmers right from the beginning of the process, it can produce benefit, it can produce positive change in grazing systems.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. And that's one thing that I wouldn't say we have just started to talk about here in New Zealand, but we are quite used to run what we call farm-led ecosystem trials, where, at the beginning, it seems to be an exercise of academics, and then just show to the farmers to critique or ask in the middle of the results collection, so how do you think it goes? So like we've been talking quite a bit of time, citizen science and co-design, co-development from the very beginning. I think it's a move forward, even just to use it in a kind of cybernetic approach to get to the final goal that we all determine at the very beginning. So is there any comment or any other suggestion or question to the speakers?
I think Pablo, Richard had that question, which I don't know if anybody wants to answer. If I can rephrase that so everybody remembers the question again. He asked that, how we talked about the New Zealand landscape having been transformed by the presence of introduced species. Are there examples from across the world where a similar thing has happened? Yeah, if anybody wants to address that.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the distinction between grazing that may have occurred through mammalian grazing before human intervention in the form of human grazing management, and that being replaced by domesticated herds and managed by, obviously, in that way. And was there a view that the indigenous biodiversity or the native biodiversity that existed before human managed grazing had any distinctive value that was beyond what has been created now by the use of domestic stock?
I can address that a little bit.
Go ahead, Lynn.
Okay, well, the problem is that usually when livestock are introduced or when new people arrive in a new destination, they not only bring livestock, but a suite of plants with them. And that changes the environment pretty profoundly. So everything changes. So sometimes people say, why don't we take the livestock away and just keep indigenous grazers? Because that was quote unquote natural and the way things are supposed to be. But in fact, the vegetation's already completely changed in our state. So it's a really complicated. That would be my comment. That's not very helpful, but.
Any other comment around, or I have seen or got a comment or answer to Richard's question?
If not, Pablo, we can move on to the question that's on the chat. Do you see it from Belny?
Yeah, go ahead. I can barely see. Go ahead if you like.
Belny, if you're here, do you want to read out the question or?
Go ahead, Ritoli. I think. Yeah.
Okay, the question that was posed here is how to unite the practices used in the production of ruminants in all terrestrial ecosystems. Although the world is wonderfully diverse, would it be possible to adapt the practices used by African pastors and the research carried out in these places and create a bank of experiences that more countries can access? I'm mainly referring to the traditional practices of these pastorals. Thank you, Belny, Brazil. If anybody wants to respond to that, again, please feel free.
Well, because there is the African pastoralists mentioned, maybe I start to try and answer. Well, what we just have heard from Fred is that we should get back to local solutions. And so I think what the African pastoralists do is, of course, very well adapted to their environment. But what we see all across at least Asia, Europe, and Africa, where I have my experience, that herders and mobile herders, transhuman herders, have similar practices. And so, yes, there are parallel herding and corralling approaches, but they are then, of course, modified or need to be modified according to the vegetation, according to the rainfall pattern, and so on. And yeah, so it's certainly not possible to harmonize these practices, but maybe the idea of collecting the knowledge in a compendium, which is simple enough also for entre guillemets practitioners in extension, it would be a very nice idea. Like the WCAT compendium for soil fertility management. Maybe we should think of something like that.
Excellent suggestion. Well, hopefully we can compile some of our experience in the book that we are putting together, and the special issue that we have just open for anybody that want to have his or her voice listen through a writing manuscript in sustainability now. Just a reminder, we are going to have all these talks in a form of video book that is going to be linked, each talk is going to be linked to the pertinent book chapter there. Also, I should say that there is an FAO pastoralist hub where we put every now and then, and there is a group, they are working in pastoralist issues that you can go ahead and have a look, Bill. If not, flick me an email and I can contact you with that group and introduce you to that group.
I think Nick, Tyler, and Fred both have some comments to make.
Good.
Yes, I had a comment to the last question and answer, which actually reflects on the one before that. One of the things we all focus on is species that are adapted to the local environment. And as regards learning from herders who work with local species and what their knowledge can do to commercial operations, well, if you think of reindeer herders and reindeer, those animals are adapted to the local environment, and so they're grazing outside throughout the year. But on the other hand, sheep and cattle in Scandinavia and in the north are an introduced species. They don't belong here. So they are outside in the summer, but they're indoors all winter. And that makes me think of the first question, which was, could we think of another example where introduced species have altered the environment? Well, of course. I mean, all domesticated ruminants have domesticated 7,000 years ago, completely altered the vegetation of Europe. They're an introduced species, they don't belong here, and they have massively modified our environment, if you take that long-term perspective. But certainly, sheep and cattle farmers are going, and in the north, are going to learn nothing from herders, because sheep and cattle farmers are operating with animals that can't survive here unless they're kept indoors all the wintertime. Oh, yeah, all the wintertime. Okay.
Good, thank you, Nick. I see, Fred, you raise your hand. Is that right?
Yes, Pablo. I was going to quickly follow up on Eva and Bertrand, their discussion and examples, and point out that during the last 10 years that I was at Utah State University, we had a program called Behave that was knowledge co-production. We were working hand in hand with innovative producers from across the US and around the world, actually. And we all saw ourselves as students trying to learn. We were all trying to learn. So I tried to get rid of, I'm the professor, you're the producer, and so forth. But one of the things that we really emphasized was trying to understand principles and processes of plant and animal behavior, because the thought was that if you can understand principles and processes, then they relate around the world. No matter where you are, those principles and processes are important, and they can inform how you manage. And so, for instance, where we might talk, Eva, about the importance and the value of shepherding practices and what can be done, and maybe talking with producers here in the US, the idea wouldn't necessarily be to tell them they should become shepherds and so forth, but to understand the principles and processes and what can be done through however you decide to move animals to accomplish goals at multiple levels, from soil health to plant diversity to wildlife abundance and so forth and so on.
Thank you, Fred. Nick, do you have another comment that we thought that you were pointing out?
Yeah, I wanted to say something really fast, in terms of, and this is also coming from working with a lot of indigenous knowledge, a lot of what is key and unique and kind of addresses the issues of a place is the place-based nature of indigenous knowledge. And while I understand this need to have a compendium which has some kind of universality to it, I think one of the biggest issues that I've heard from communities is that they don't trust it, right? They don't trust that what's going to happen to their knowledge will be essentially, great for that knowledge. So there is this issue of who gets to control and manage knowledge which actually does belong to communities, because there is a historic extractive nature in which their knowledge has been treated. So yes, I understand that creating this kind of a universal compendium has its uses, but I think we have to tread very carefully when it comes to questions of trust, questions of autonomy, and then, at what point of time, let's say a community says, I don't want to be part of this anymore, what is the accountability system around that? So.
Very good, just very good comment, Ritodi there. And we had the issues presented by the reindeer herder, Sami herder, that presented together with Professor Nick Taylor 2 months ago about the exact same issues, and reinforced by some of the message that Professor Kirani Matunga provided last week. We are so quiet this morning. Any other comment? Yeah.
I think Nick wanted to say something.
Go ahead, Nick.
Oh, I didn't actually, but I will anyway. Yes, well you're quite right, Pablo. I mean, I can give you a direct quotation from a reindeer herder. He said, the people come here and they always ask for maps. They say, where do we go? And when do we go there? And we don't tell them. Why don't we? And they say, why don't you tell them? And he said, maps are always used against us. Absolutely invariably. You tell the people where you go, they make a map. Once they've got a map, then they can start constraining where you're going to go and say, oh, well, this area, but not that area. So I completely agree with what was said about who owns the knowledge and who decides what it's used for. Right.
Now, thanks so much for saying that, Nick, because in my experience, that's literally what maps have been used for. Is it's a way of essentially controlling mobility and movement and trying to keep things within the boundaries of what, let's say, an institutional mandate has to say. And I see this a lot in the Trans-Himalayan landscape, where herders often cross across state boundaries. And I've spent a long time in the mountains, and I still don't know the passes that they used to bring their yaks over. They're never going to tell me, because that inside their head, that knowledge is essentially what allows them to still practice transhumance.
So any other comment? So if not, I will just tell what's going to happen next Monday. Next Monday, it's the last session. So the way it's going to go, we are going to have several speakers. And finally, we could fit Fred there. Fred was supposed to open the workshop, and because of a lot of people having a good time in Montana, the internet wasn't fast enough, right, Fred? But Fred is going to, after the session 1 in the morning, and after all the talks of the scientists, and before what we call the session of Multi-Scapes, Fred is gonna wrap up and put together his wonderful talk and paper. We are going to have later, after Fred's talk, we are going to have one of the directors of our National Science Challenge over land and water. We are going to have the chairman of the Beef and Lamb New Zealand, and we are also going to have the Minister of Agriculture of New Zealand. And last but not least, I hope I can, in 5 minutes, wrap up and define Multi-Scapes. So it's been wonderful today to have you all present. The speakers were fantastic, and I look forward to see you all next Monday, sadly in the last event of this international workshop, Raising in Future Multi-Scapes. So thank you very much to everybody, and I'll see you next Monday.